Honourable Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll be splitting my time with the member for Mission Matsqui, Fraser Canyon. I rise to speak on Bill C-14, an act to amend the Constitution Act of 1867. More specifically, what this bill will do is amend what is known as the Grandfather Clause. By way of background, the Grandfather Clause has been part of our Constitution since 1986 with the passage of the Representation Act of 1985. Very simply, what the Grandfather Clause does is it establishes a floor in terms of the allocation of seats by province in terms of the redistribution process that takes place every 10 years. And the floor that the Grandfather Clause sets is that no province shall be allocated fewer seats in future redistributions than that province had in 1985. Madam Speaker, Bill C-14 is a fairly straightforward piece of legislation in that it amends the Grandfather Clause by establishing an updated floor, a floor of 2015 as opposed to 1985. More specifically, Madam Speaker, what that does is it will ensure that no province will receive an allocation of fewer seats than that province had in 2015 in the 43rd Parliament in any future redistribution. What that means for my province of Alberta, Madam Speaker, is that it increases the floor in terms of the minimal number of seats that Alberta will be allocated in any redistribution by 13 seats that Alberta gained between 1985 and 2015. When we look at the issue of allocating seats across Canada, a foundational principle of our democratic process is representation by population. Representation by population is based upon the notion that the weight attached to the vote of each Canadian should be equal regardless of what region of Canada they live in. It is a principle that was adopted by the Fathers of Confederation in 1867, and it is a principle that is enshrined in our Constitution. Madam Speaker, while it is a principle that is foundational, achieving pure representation by population is not practical. Indeed, it is not entirely desirable, having regard for a number of factors, including the vastness of Canada. With respect to the impracticability of achieving pure representation by population, one look no further than our Constitution. For example, the Senatorial Clause of 1915 guarantees that every province shall have at least the same number of seats in the House of Commons as it has senators. That is why, for example, the province of Prince Edward Island is guaranteed 4 seats in the House of Commons because it has 4 senators, notwithstanding the fact that the province of Prince Edward Island has fewer than 160,000 people. Indeed, my riding of St. Albert Edmonton is almost as large as Prince Edward Island. My friend and colleague down the road in Edmonton-Wetaskiwin represents a riding of more than 200,000 people, 40 or 50,000 more people than Prince Edward Island. One might say, well, simply rescind or repeal the Senatorial Clause, but of course, Madam Speaker, that requires the unanimous consent of the provinces, and Prince Edward Island, I'm sure, will be in no hurry to offer its consent. And so achieving pure representation by population isn't practicable, but it is also important to take into account what the Supreme Court of Canada provided for in the Saskatchewan boundaries reference case of 1991. That case dealt with the boundary redistribution in the province of Saskatchewan that tended to disproportionately favor rural areas at the expense of more populous urban areas. The court looked at Section 3 of the Charter, which guarantees the right of every Canadian to vote, and in the context of the redistribution of boundaries in the province of Saskatchewan, the Supreme Court determined that the overriding principle is one of effective representation. In terms of effective representation, the court recognized such factors as geography, communities of interest, and so on. But that being said, the court did stress the importance of representation by population. And to that end, I would cite Madam Justice McLaughlin, who said, quote, what are the conditions of effective representation? The first is relative parity of voting power. A system which dilutes one citizen's vote unduly as compared with another citizen's vote runs the risk of providing inadequate representation of the citizen whose vote is diluted, closed quote. And so, in order to have effective representation, what we must have to the greatest degree possible is representation by population. And that is where we have moved significantly towards, thanks to the leadership of Prime Minister Harper and the previous Conservative government with the passage of the Fair Representation Act. The Fair Representation Act replaced the 1985 formula, which establishes an electoral quotient, which is the first step in terms of determining the allocation of seats, with a new formula that sets a new electoral quotient. The problem, very simply, Madam Speaker, with the 1985 formula is, although it was thought to be fair in 1985, it did not allow for the allocation of seats by province to keep up with population growth amongst the fastest growing provinces. As a result, the fastest growing provinces were denied their right to fair, proportionate representation in the House of Commons. It created, over time, a representation gap. Take, for example, my province of Alberta. Alberta gained nearly 1 million people between 1988 and 2004. And yet, in the span of nearly 20 years, with 1 million new Albertans, Alberta only gained 2 seats in the House of Commons. So significant was the representation gap at the time that the Fair Representation Act was introduced that there was some analysis that established that the 3 fastest growing provinces in Canada, namely that of Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta, were among the most underrepresented provinces or states in the industrialized world, according to analysis at the time from the Mowat Center. Madam Speaker, the Fair Representation Act addressed the representation gap significantly by establishing a new formula that, in short, better takes into account population growth, all the while respecting the overriding principle of effective representation. What that has meant in the last 2 redistributions is an increase in representation for the provinces of Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta. My province of Alberta has gained 9 seats in the span of 10 years. Ontario gained 18 seats in the first redistribution. The province of British Columbia, 8 seats. That gap is being closed thanks to the legacy of Prime Minister Harper and the formula provided for in the Fair Representation Act. Madam Speaker, in closing, let me just say that this legislation, I'm pleased to see, does not in any major way impact upon the Harper formula. It maintains the Harper formula, and in that regard, maintains the significant step forward to achieving something much closer to a representation by population, which the Supreme Court said is essential to have effective representation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kings Heads.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and let me thank my honourable colleague for his remarks. We may not always agree on the discussion points in politics, but I do respect his ability to stand before the House without a note and to be able to recite his speeches and to be able to bring forward his points. Madam Speaker, I just had a Q&A with the Member of Parliament from Peace River Westlock, the honourable colleague's colleague, about the rurality of the country and the fact that that member's riding is actually 100,000 square kilometres, and he talked about effective representation. We talked about the challenge, of course, notwithstanding the fact that there has been a rural-urban shift, that it is important to take into consideration those elements such that rural MPs can still actually represent their constituents in a reasonable fashion. Would this member agree that on the current structure, when we actually look at the dynamic within the provinces, within the territories, we have to make sure that rural representation remains an important piece, particularly with the size and geography of federal ridings at this point?
The Honourable Member for Prince Albert Edmonton.
St. Albert Edmonton. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for that. And I want to thank my colleague from Kings Heads for his important question. And in short, I would absolutely concur with him that we need to take into allowance issues of population and geography, like my friend, the member for Peace River Westlock, outlined in terms of representing 100,000 square kilometres, representing an area that comprises of 500 provincial, municipal, and band officials. And, Madam Speaker, that is taken to account in terms of the Electoral Boundaries Readjustment Act, in terms of taking into account those factors which the Supreme Court specifically cited in the Saskatchewan reference case in terms of establishing and maintaining effective representation.
Questions and comments?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his intervention today. Very, very detailed and fact-based, and I appreciate his attention to detail. He did talk about the member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin having, 200,000 constituents in his riding, and something that I've been thinking a lot about is the nature of representation when we look at the difference between rural and urban. And I wonder if the member would be able to speak to whether ridings should, considering the difference in priorities, the different challenges that rural and urban ridings face, would he be interested in making sure that as we determine these 3 new seats in Alberta, that we do have those urban and rural priorities in line?
Before I give the floor back to the member for St. Albert Edmonton, could I ask that we keep some silence so that we can actually hear the questions and the answers? Thank you so much. The Honourable Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Edmonton for that important question. And she's quite right when she speaks of the Edmonton-Wetaskiwin riding, which takes in the deep south of suburban Edmonton and then has a farming and small town component to the riding. And what I would say is that is something the boundaries commissions of each province take into account in terms of the factors that they consider in drawing boundaries, including having regard for communities of interest and ensuring to the greatest degree possible that the boundaries of each riding align with communities of interest while at the same time trying to maintain as best as possible roughly equal population size.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his usual intelligent speech. And I want to expand on the question from the previous member, because when I look at Toronto and I see that we have more than 20 members representing, a riding that arguably I've driven from one side to the other is not that different. Is there a question that we should be asking at this time about whether or not certainly they need more people to support that many individuals in terms of services, but do we really need that many members? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, Madam Speaker, it's a good question from my friend, the member for Sarnia-Lambton. And again, there are different challenges that members of Parliament face representing urban areas and rural areas. That is taken into account, having regard for additional resources that members who represent larger ridings by population as well as larger ridings by virtue of their geography. But again, I underscore that when we allocate seats and when we draw boundaries, the principle that must be respected to the greatest degree possible is representation by population.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
I want to thank my colleague for his speech. And while we're discussing, representation here in this House, I talked earlier about the important work we need to do in terms of gender balance here and also proportionality. I've talked a lot about young people and the lack of their opportunities to have a seat at the table, Madam Speaker. We know that young people right now at 16 years old, they can drive a car, they can work, they pay taxes in this country, and we know that if they participate at a young age, they got a better chance of voting later in the future. So my question to my colleague, there's a bill before the House, C-210, tabled by my colleague from Skeena-Bulkley Valley. Does he support allowing those that can drive?
Order, please. Can we hear the questions? The Honourable Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my friend from Courtenay Alberni for that question. Let me just say in short, I believe in principle that the voting age of 18 is the most appropriate age. However, I do look forward to the debate on the bill.